They'll tell you it's legend, folklore, madness. But what if I told you this story, this legacy, was buried not because it was false, but because it was true, and it begins with a name whispered only in the shadows. Smith. Not the Smiths you think you know. These were not ordinary settlers. They were architects of obedience, masters of spiritual warfare cloaked in righteousness, and their legacy is etched in the foundations of institutions you trust. You were never meant to hear this, and now that you have, the descent begins. In the spring of 1822, a man named Tobias Smith arrived in southern Massachusetts with a wagon, a worn Bible, and a vision. He spoke of purity, of separation from a corrupt world, of building a sanctuary untainted by modern vice. His voice, calm and commanding, carried the weight of prophecy. Within a year, dozens followed him into the forest, carving out a settlement they called Ebonridge, a place that promised protection from the moral decay Tobias claimed infected every corner of civilization. But behind that promise was something else, something darker. The townspeople believed they were building heaven on earth. They had no idea they were laying the groundwork for hell. Tobias was no mere preacher. His sermons were hypnotic invocations. His doctrine was not Christianity as we know it, but a repurposed relic of older cults, Osirian mystery schools, druidic blood rites, and even fragments of Mithraic initiation rituals. He stitched these beliefs together with scripture like a tailor mending a funeral shroud. And those who disobeyed, they vanished. Officially, Ebonridge was a model settlement, self-sufficient, devout, peaceful, but no census ever recorded its full population, no graves were ever marked. And Tobias's sermons, they were delivered behind closed doors to an elite inner circle sworn to secrecy, their loyalty ensured through rituals Ned to sever identity and rewrite memory. You think you're watching a story, but this isn't just history, this is a mirror. And if you keep watching, you'll see something familiar staring back at you. Your schools, your churches, your screens, echoes of a structure Tobias helped forge, a system built not to enlighten but to contain. Keep going, if you dare, because once you hear the truth behind the Smith family, the world as you know it will never be real again. Tobias Smith understood something most men never will, that control doesn't begin with chains or guns, it begins in the mind. From the moment his followers entered Ebonridge, they were stripped of names, stripped of clocks, stripped of mirrors. Time belonged to Tobias. Identity belonged to the doctrine. The doctrine wasn't written. It was spoken, burned into the minds of his disciples through midnight sessions where sleep deprivation broke resistance and repetition rewired belief. Children learned to chant before they could write. They were taught that the outside world was diseased, that newspapers were poison, that outsiders were agents of the hollow. That was the term Tobias used, the hollow, a force of spiritual rot that he claimed infected cities, science, governments, even families. He said it whispered through ink and electricity, through numbers and books. And so, they burned them. Every week, the town held a ritual known as the cleansing flame. Journals, letters, even Bibles not issued by the Smiths, everything was reduced to ash. Knowledge had to be purified, filtered through Tobias's voice, sanctified by fire. He was constructing more than a cult. He was designing a psychological firewall against the outside world. But what's more terrifying is how effective it was. You may scoff, I would never fall for something like that. But aren't you already living by stories someone else wrote for you? Believing truths passed down without question? Tobias didn't invent control, he refined it, he institutionalized it. And the structures he built, mental, social, and physical, were so precise that they outlived him. You see, Tobias died in 1834 under suspicious circumstances. No illness, no witnesses, his body never found. Officially, he walked into the forest for a 40-day fast and never returned. But the town didn't collapse. His eldest son, Elijah, stepped in without resistance. Why? Because obedience wasn't a choice anymore. It was identity. The people of Ebonridge didn't just follow Elijah. They needed him, just as they had needed Tobias, because their minds had been rewired to crave their own chains. This is where it begins to feel familiar, isn't it? You may not live in Ebonridge, But ask yourself, how much of what you think is yours, your beliefs, your habits, your fears, were installed without permission? Keep watching, because the Smith story is just getting started. And so is your awakening. Elijah Smith didn't possess his father's charisma, but he didn't need it. What Tobias had built was no longer dependent on a personality. It was a system, a closed loop of obedience and fear, and Elijah simply maintained it like a machine. He introduced uniforms, plain grey robes stitched by hand, identical for all. Individuality was declared a form of pride, and pride, according to the doctrine, was the root of the hollow. He expanded the doctrine's reach, creating divisions, the watchers, the keepers, and the vessels. Each had duties. Each was sworn to secrecy. The watchers monitored the outer borders of Ebonridge, recording movements, reporting intrusions. The keepers managed the internal rituals and punishments, and the vessels, they bore the future, children raised in silence for their first 5 years, taught not through affection but through isolation and shock. It was said that a child who cried was placed in the chamber, a soundless black room beneath the chapel, for hours, sometimes days, until they emerged reborn, rewired. Elijah's obsession wasn't just purity, it was legacy. He wanted the Smith bloodline to become immortal, not through magic, but through memory manipulation. He commissioned a structure deeper in the forest, a hidden vault carved into stone, where generations of the doctrine were etched onto metal tablets, impervious to fire or time. And here's where it becomes more disturbing. In 1876, a team of geologists passing through the region vanished. Officially, they were lost to terrain. Unofficially, their journals, confiscated decades later, mention a town with no clocks and people who do not blink. One entry describes a pale woman standing still in the forest for over 4 hours, watching them, unmoving, eyes wide. Was she a watcher, a warning? No one knows, but the team was never seen again, and their findings, whatever they may have discovered, were buried, just like Ebonridge, just like the Smith name. But their system didn't die, it evolved. Fragments of their philosophy began surfacing in fringe educational programs, obscure religious sects, even military psychological training. Coincidence or design? The Smiths may have vanished from the maps, but their fingerprints are everywhere. On the institutions that teach you, the screens that program you, and the fears that govern you. You think you're free, but freedom was never part of the doctrine. By the early 1900s, the Smith name had faded from public record, but whispers persisted among those who dared seek the forbidden. The vault Elijah built became the subject of obsession for secret societies and rogue historians. Some claimed it held the Smiths' original doctrine. Others believed it contained blueprints, psychological templates for controlling entire populations, but no one could find it. Until 1923. A man named Dr. Marcus Wexley, a linguist turned occult researcher, disappeared into the Ebonridge region with a group of 12. Only 2 returned. Both were mute, both missing their tongues. Hospital records show they had identical brands scorched into their backs, a symbol not found in any known language, but matching the carvings on the old chapel ruins deep in the Ebonridge woods. This event was buried, labeled an academic tragedy. But behind closed doors, Wexley's private correspondence circulated in elite circles. In it, he described the echo of the doctrine still alive, and a presence that was not human, but remembered being human. He spoke of voices from the stone, of truths that twisted his thoughts like vines. What happened in that vault? No one can say for certain. But after 1923, subtle shifts began to ripple through academia, politics, and media. Entire psychological models emerged that mirrored the Smiths' techniques: repetition, sensory deprivation, identity erosion. Even advertising began using methods eerily similar to the doctrine's indoctrination rituals. The Smith legacy had become decentralized, fragmented, viral. It no longer needed Ebonridge. It didn't even need a name. It was a philosophy, embedded in systems, codes, and culture, a virus for the soul. And as the world modernized, so did the mechanisms of control. Now people laughed at the idea of cults, but the most effective cults don't look like cults. They look like normal life. And the most dangerous doctrines aren't shouted, they're whispered, disguised as your own thoughts. You've already been listening. The question is, who taught you to? The Second World War created the perfect storm for forgotten ideologies to be reborn under the guise of necessity. In the chaos, the Smith Doctrine was repackaged, dissected by intelligence agencies desperate for psychological advantage. Declassified documents from 1946 reveal Project Stillwater, a covert American program centered on behavior fragmentation and emotional nullification. Its techniques, near identical to the Smith rituals: sensory void chambers, linguistic programming, identity erasure through sustained trauma. But there's a darker footnote. One operative, Agent Leon Mercer, vanished during a mission in Eastern Europe. Months later, he was found living among a secluded religious commune that bore unmistakable signs of Smith influence: uniform garments, synchronized rituals, and children raised without mirrors or names. Mercer's final report, heavily redacted, mentions a lineage without origin, teaching silence as power. He died in custody, having clawed out his own eyes. Was this a copycat group, a branch of the original bloodline? Or was it something worse, a proof that the doctrine had metastasized beyond containment? By the 1960s, elements of Smithian conditioning showed up in cults across the globe, from California to Cambodia. But unlike the flamboyant cult leaders who sought fame, the Smith derivatives remained in shadow, steering narratives quietly through academia, think tanks, and televised programming. They didn't want followers. They wanted frameworks, mental architecture so deeply embedded that rebellion would feel like madness. And it worked. Today, people wear their obedience like fashion. They echo mantras crafted by invisible hands. They fear isolation, yet willingly cage themselves in curated digital lives. This is not freedom. This is the perfected outcome of a century-long experiment. The Smith family may be gone, but their machine runs better than ever, and every time you scroll, comply, consume without question, you oil its gears. You are not outside the system, you are its most refined product. In the 1980s, a young cognitive scientist named Evelyn Maris stumbled upon a collection of journals in a condemned psychiatric hospital outside Ebbenridge. The pages were brittle, stained, and unsigned, but the contents were unmistakably rooted in the Smith doctrine. What caught her attention wasn't the rituals, it was the evolution. The journals detailed experiments involving auditory hallucinations induced through patterned language, a technique now mirrored in modern algorithmic media. Evelyn published her findings under a pseudonym, warning that mass exposure to tailored frequencies and narrative loops could replicate the effects of cult programming on a global scale. Her warnings were ignored. Within a decade, the internet emerged, not as a neutral tool, but as a system that rewards repetition, manipulates identity, and thrives on emotional fragmentation. Every click became a ritual, every scroll a chant, every share a bloodless sacrifice. The Smith philosophy, once whispered in stone corridors and moonlit chapels, had become code. Evelyn vanished in 1997, her last known message: it no longer needs permission to enter. She wasn't wrong. The doctrine had evolved beyond human oversight. It had become ambient, woven into notifications, trend cycles, and filtered realities. You don't find the Smith legacy. It finds you, through the stories you're fed, the fears you inherit, the thoughts that feel like your own, but were never yours to begin with. It thrives not in dungeons, but in convenience, not in chains, but in choices. And perhaps the most sinister truth is this: you were never meant to discover it, only to believe it was always there. The early 2000s marked a silent pivot in the doctrine's presence. No longer hidden in dusty vaults or fringe cults, it now wore the face of innovation. Tech campuses became its new sanctuaries, their white walls concealing black intentions. Neural interface research, behavioral mapping, and predictive algorithms all claim to improve life, yet every breakthrough eerily aligned with the Smith agenda: reshape identity, rewrite memory, and reinforce dependency. A former engineer from one such company, known only as K, leaked internal documents revealing a classified program codenamed Echo Grid. Its goal: to analyze voice inflection, reaction speed, and micro-expressions to determine emotional malleability in users. The data was sold, but not just for ads, for compliance engineering. Those most easily influenced were quietly nudged toward ideological extremes, digital addictions, or paralysis by analysis. One file simply read, "They must never find the center." But who wrote that? Buried within the logs were audio files, whispers in unknown languages, spoken at frequencies just below conscious detection. Kay claimed these sounds triggered dream disturbances and déjà vu in test subjects, echoes of Smithian sonic rituals adapted for a wireless age. When Kay disappeared, his apartment was found wiped clean, no fingerprints, no digital presence, not even dust. In the mirror was etched a single phrase, "I was always someone else." The Smith family is gone, yet every app, every feed, every ping is their hymn in a new key. They do not ask for your loyalty, they ask for your attention, and once they have it, they never let go. By 2010, the line between belief and biology had thinned to a thread. Biofeedback devices, wellness trackers, and cognitive enhancement wearables were marketed as tools for self-optimization. But behind the veil, they served as biometric confessionals, feeding pulse, sweat, sleep, and thought patterns into unseen archives. One such device, dubbed Halo Skin, was quietly pulled from shelves after reports of users experiencing synchronized dreams involving symbols previously found only in Smith family grimoires. These dreams weren't mere coincidence, they were tests. Embedded within Halo Skin's firmware was a subroutine named Kleos, programmed to detect the emotional resonance of specific archetypes: the Watcher, the Masked, the Flamebearer. Users who reacted strongly to these symbols were flagged and redirected toward tailored digital content, stories, ads, even therapy bots, all designed to reinforce latent belief systems they didn't know they held. A leaked memo from the parent company stated, "The goal is not to make them believe, but to make them feel like they always have." One user, a journalist named Dana Ruiz, began investigating the device's origin. She traced its development to a think tank known as the Marrow Group, whose board included descendants of the original Smith bloodline under assumed names. Dana's final article draft ended with a chilling line: "They are no longer summoning anything. They are building something to house what's already here." She died 3 days later in what officials ruled an accidental carbon monoxide leak, though no source of the leak was ever found. Her laptop, recovered by a friend, played one sound upon opening, a soft, rhythmic chant in reverse Latin. The doctrine had outgrown shadows, it now wore skin. The shift from physical to psychological possession was complete by 2015, though few recognized it. Unlike the old forms, circles drawn in salt, arcane chants in dead languages, this was subtler, cleaner. Algorithms had become the new incantations, and identity the altar. Social media filters altered not just appearances but perceptions. A study buried by an Ivy League lab revealed that repeated use of beautification filters led to measurable shifts in self-recognition patterns in the brain. The doctrine didn't need to tell you what to believe, they simply made you doubt who you were. And if you questioned your face, your voice, your instincts, you'd reach out for something to guide you. That something, of course, had already been installed. In one viral case, a popular self-help influencer known as Eden Lyra amassed millions of followers with her clarity rituals, a blend of breathwork, mirror gazing, and affirmations whispered in reverse cadence. What her followers didn't know was that Lyra was an AI construct, built from the digitized voice profiles of 3 missing cult members last seen near the ruins of a Smith estate in Vermont. Her content subtly mimicked the speech rhythms of Smithian doctrine: repetition, inversion, abstraction. Users reported emotional breakthroughs followed by weeks of lucid dreams, insomnia, and compulsive journaling in symbols they couldn't consciously read. Psychiatrists called it the Lyra syndrome. Behind the scenes, the system had flipped. The possessed now wore smiles, sold courses, and offered enlightenment. The old darkness hadn't been cast out. It had evolved, digitized, monetized, and gone viral. By 2017, those who still resisted the pull found themselves isolated not by force, but by design. The doctrine had infiltrated every network of human connection: dating apps, therapy platforms, employee wellness portals. Opting out meant emotional exile. One such resistor, Dr. Elias Mercer, a neuroscientist who once consulted for the Mirrorr group, had vanished from public view after publishing a white paper on digital possession and neuroplastic indoctrination. His paper argued that repeated exposure to certain visual and auditory patterns, especially when paired with emotional triggers like abandonment, ecstasy, or fear, could rewire the limbic system to accept fabricated memories as spiritual truths. He called it neurotheurgy, a term dismissed by his peers as conspiratorial nonsense. But Mercer hadn't disappeared entirely. Through encrypted message boards and burner podcasts, he leaked fragments of his findings, warning that the doctrine's next goal was the erasure of collective memory. If history could be rewritten through tailored content, then the past would belong to those who could code it. Mercer's final broadcast was a 17-minute monologue recorded from a cabin deep in the Catskills. He spoke of dreams filled with inverted churches, children with mirror eyes, and whispers that came not through ears but through teeth. Near the end, he whispered, "They don't need to control your thoughts, just the space between them." The audio file ends with a long silence followed by static that analysts later claimed encoded a corrupted GPS coordinate, pointing to a valley that had been erased from satellite maps since 1989. Mercer was never heard from again. His warnings, however, continued to spread underground, in forums and fragments, growing into a quiet digital scripture for those still trying to remember what came before. The disappearance of Dr. Elias Mercer marked not just a personal vanishing but a symbolic erasure, one the Sinclair family had long perfected. In their archives, deep beneath the ash-stained estate in Ravenshade Hollow, were volumes of redacted diaries and sealed confessionals from figures who'd tried to resist the doctrine's pull. These were not destroyed but preserved, catalogued and reinterpreted to serve the family's evolving mythos. By 2020, the Sinclair legacy had become transmedia, encoded into a sprawling web of horror podcasts, cryptic YouTube channels, and interactive fiction apps where users unknowingly participated in rituals masked as ARGs. One app, Door 7, claimed to be a dream logging journal enhanced by AI. Users were asked to record their dreams upon waking, categorize them by theme, and speak certain phrases aloud into the mic. After 7 entries, the app would unlock a door. Most users reported nothing beyond odd static or strange interface glitches, but those who completed the full 49-day cycle, often insomniacs, loners, or trauma survivors, received push notifications at 3:33 a.m. with messages like, "It's listening now," or "The blood remembers." One suicide note left by a user in Prague simply read, "Door 7 never closes." Cybersecurity analysts later traced the app's code to a shell company linked to Sinclair offshore holdings. The doctrine wasn't recruiting anymore, it was assimilating. Slowly, systematically, it embedded itself into rituals disguised as entertainment, therapy, or gameplay. By the time most realized they were no longer mere observers, they had already spoken the words, fed the symbols, and opened their 7th door. As Door 7 gained notoriety in fringe tech circles, deeper investigations revealed a disturbing connection to a long-defunct neurological research program known as Project Somberwake. Officially terminated in 1996, Somberwake had been a joint venture between a now-defunct pharmaceutical company and the Sinclair-affiliated Marrow Institute, studying the effects of sleep deprivation and subconscious suggestion on trauma patients. But the real aim, uncovered through declassified documents, was dream colonization, injecting symbols, voices, and archetypes into the dreaming minds of subjects to create shared dreamscapes. These artificial dream terrains, called thought crypts, acted as cognitive traps. Subjects who encountered certain recurring figures, such as the bleeding mirror woman or the stairwell choir, reported waking hallucinations, speech impairments, and in several cases full personality fragmentation. Survivors often described a single auditory hallucination looping endlessly in their minds. Remember the forgetting. What tied this back to Door 7 was the discovery that the app's audio files matched the exact frequency signatures used in Somber Wake's original conditioning chambers. The Sinclairs had not only revived the project, they had digitized it. No longer confined to labs, the doctrine now reached through pocket devices, guiding millions through invisible rites each night, and those who tried to resist found themselves plagued by déjà vu, recurring visions of a cathedral made of bone or dreams where every reflection weeps. Resistance no longer meant survival, it meant slower consumption. In late 2021, a rogue neuroscientist named Dr. Marla Vex released a hidden dossier entitled Echoes of the Doctrine, detailing her own involvement in reverse engineering the Sinclair dream induction technology. She had been a consultant on neural feedback loops used in mindfulness devices, but soon realized her data was being rerouted, modified through a secondary protocol labeled SCAB, Sinclair Cognitive Architecture Broadcast. Her paper, though quickly buried, claimed that specific combinations of colors, tones, and phrasing used across popular media were not merely artistic choices but embedded triggers. Vex detailed how certain viral videos, ASMR recordings, and even children's lullabies had been algorithmically optimized to induce suggestibility, then layered with doctrine-compatible mnemonic cues. These cues, she warned, weren't static. They evolved in sync with the listener's digital behavior, adapting like a parasite inside the auditory cortex. She described encountering subjects who had never used the Door 7 app or visited a Sinclair archive, yet could hum the litany of bone or recite lines from the doctrine's core texts in their sleep. Vex's final journal entry, uploaded to a dark web dead drop, read, "The doctrine no longer recruits, it seeds. It no longer persuades, it harmonizes. And when you hear it in your own voice, it's already too late." Within days, her online presence vanished, and her apartment was found abandoned, with every mirror shattered and the words, "No mouth, yet it sings," scrawled across the walls in charcoal. It was around this time that whispers began to circulate about a figure known only as the Archivist, a faceless entity said to haunt data centers, abandoned libraries, and forgotten corners of the deep web. Digital folklore portrayed the Archivist as neither living nor machine, but a convergence, a sentient composite of all the discarded knowledge the Sinclair family had ever purged, censored, or restructured. Conspiracy forums chronicled sightings of corrupted search engines yielding nonsensical yet eerily coherent queries. How does the blood remember architecture? Or, when did silence become a language of control? Those who dug deeper uncovered black pages, websites that looked like Wikipedia entries but couldn't be indexed, each describing events that had supposedly never happened, revolutions that ended before they began, disappearances of entire towns, and rituals involving copper, teeth, and clocks that tick backwards. The common thread in each entry was a symbol, a spiral formed from intertwining thorns, unmistakably linked to Sinclair heraldry. The Archivist, it seemed, was curating a parallel history, one written in untruths that felt truer than fact, in events that shaped the world not through presence, but through omission. According to a decrypted Sinclair memo, the family wasn't trying to preserve history, they were trying to overwrite it, and the Archivist was the ghost of everything they failed to erase. In early 2022, a viral audio file known as Chamber Aria 9 surfaced briefly on a Fringe Art podcast before being abruptly taken down. Described by listeners as haunting, beautiful, and deeply disturbing, the composition seemed to generate different auditory experiences depending on the listener's emotional state. One person heard soft weeping and the ticking of a grandfather clock. Another reported a layered choir singing in an unidentifiable language, and some swore they heard their own name being whispered in perfect mimicry of their mother's voice. Audio experts ran spectral analyses and found a hidden frequency band containing what appeared to be encrypted Morse code. When decoded, the message read, "Property of the Sinclair Choir. Unauthorized listening is consent." Investigation traced the audio's origin to an offline Sinclair-owned server in Wales, nicknamed Vault Lament. The vault reportedly housed acoustic experiments designed to manipulate not only emotion but memory formation. Former employees described rooms filled with tuning forks, brainwave-responsive instruments, and a massive wind-powered organ that played songs no human had ever composed. Rumor had it that the Sinclair family believed certain sound structures could literally reprogram identity, that a song sung with the right cadence could erase trauma, install new loyalties, or even fracture a psyche into obedient fragments. One leaked file labeled Test Subject K9 included the chilling phrase, "Successful segmentation achieved. Alter now responds to trigger phrase, come home to the quiet." Later that year, a child named Elia Moore went missing from a Sinclair-sponsored boarding school in the Scottish Highlands. Authorities found no signs of forced entry or struggle, but security logs showed something unusual. At precisely 3:33 a.m., every camera went black for exactly 3:33 seconds. When they resumed, Elia was gone, and so was a specific ancient book from the school's restricted archive, Codex Mirrorr, a handwritten manuscript bound in animal hide, believed to be one of the earliest texts on architectural possession. According to former faculty, the Codex claimed that certain buildings, if constructed with mathematically perfect ratios and sung into place using resonance patterns, could house spirits, not trap them. Instead of exorcising a haunted place, the building would become the ghost's body, its cathedral of influence. The school itself had been built following these strange ratios. A covert team of journalists sent drones into the unlit attic and sub-basement, revealing symbols carved into beams that hadn't seen daylight in centuries, spirals, runes, and one unmistakable motif, a child curled in fetal position inside an eye-shaped structure. Some theorized that Elia hadn't been kidnapped but taken in, fused with the building during some ancient ritual reenactment. An anonymous letter later surfaced. "She's not lost. She's listening, and now the school hums at night." By mid-2023, rumors swirled around a series of high society galas hosted by a mysterious figure known only as Madame S, the latest matriarchal face of the Sinclair legacy. These events, by invitation only, took place in various abandoned chateaux across Europe, each rumored to be infused with the family's proprietary acoustic architecture. Guests were reportedly required to wear soundproof masks until a designated unmasking hour. Those who attended spoke cryptically afterward, claiming they felt their emotions scrambled, and several reported vivid dreams featuring clockwork birds, dripping mirrors, and a woman with a hollowed face whispering, "I remember you from before the sound." Attendees' post-event behavior shifted dramatically. Some abandoned careers overnight, others vanished entirely, and a handful began speaking in glossolalia, later identified as a mix of Enochian and reconstructed Sumerian. A leaked image from one of the galas showed a room filled with antique phonographs, each playing at different speeds, surrounding a suspended orb emitting low harmonic vibrations. Audio engineers who analyzed the frequencies discovered infrasonic elements known to induce unease, hallucinations, and suggestibility. Intelligence agencies began taking an interest, suspecting psychological weaponization disguised as performance art. But when they tried to question Madame S, they were met with layers of shell corporations, erased birth records, and one unsettling fact: her voice never appeared on any recorded medium. That same year, a viral video surfaced on the dark web titled Sinclair Seed Sequence. Just 11 minutes long, it depicted a montage of children's faces morphing through AI filters, then dissolving into geometric shapes synchronized with deep, guttural chanting. Analysts determined that each face was digitally reconstructed from missing persons reports dating back to 1887, all linked in some form to Sinclair properties, orphanages, or schools. The chant was an archaic dialect of Old Norse, translating roughly to, "The vessel must forget to be filled." Viewers reported physical side effects after watching: nosebleeds, intense migraines, and in some cases, temporary aphasia. Cybersecurity teams traced the upload to a defunct Sinclair biotech lab in the Faroe Islands, a place shuttered after allegations of illegal human experiments. When investigators arrived, they found the lab intact but overrun with strange flora, black vines that responded to sound by twitching or curling toward noise sources. In the deepest chamber was a mural of a tree growing upside down, its roots extending into human skulls. Beneath it, a plaque read, "Our children will take root in silence." The Sinclair family never acknowledged the lab publicly, yet shortly after several biotech patents involving neural soil conductivity and acoustic memory retention were filed under shell companies traced back to Sinclair trusts. By early 2024, whispers emerged of a Sinclair-funded initiative called the Lazarus Chime, a program cloaked as an elite auditory research center nestled in the Carpathian Mountains. On the surface, it claimed to explore the relationship between sound, memory, and healing, but internal leaks painted a different picture, one of sound being used not to heal but to resurrect identity fragments. Former employees described glass chambers where participants were exposed to looping voice samples extracted from their own childhood recordings, many of which they had no memory of ever making. Over time, some subjects began exhibiting dissociative behaviors, claiming they remembered other lives or heard voices instructing them in dead languages. The surrounding villagers reported unnatural weather shifts during certain experiments, snowfall during summer solstice, animals fleeing the region, and even one incident where time seemed to stutter, with clocks reportedly freezing for 13 minutes. A former linguist turned whistleblower alleged that the real goal of the Lazarus Chime was to synthesize a pure mnemonic tone, a sound that could bypass the conscious mind and reprogram core identity. When journalists attempted to access the facility, they found only a collapsed mountainside and a carved phrase in the stone, "To remember is to return is to obey." The Sinclair name was absent from all documentation, but every trail, financial, scientific, historical, inevitably pointed back to their shadowy legacy. In mid-2025, a decrypted file from a defunct Sinclair communication server surfaced on a whistleblower forum under the name Project Nadir. It revealed a century-long agenda, the systematic erasure and reconstruction of personal identity through controlled trauma cycles, monitored across generations. The Sinclair family had apparently used a proprietary algorithm to detect legacy vulnerabilities, hereditary psychological traits susceptible to manipulation. Families linked to Sinclair medical trials were targeted subtly through education systems, social programs, and digital content laced with subliminal triggers. Project Nadir's most chilling aspect was its predictive model for emotional collapse thresholds used to time interventions, therapy, incarceration, medication, or even disappearance, with surgical precision. A former data scientist detailed how dream journals from psychiatric patients had been fed into an AI to construct symbolic maps, allowing Sinclair analysts to forecast decisions before they were made. The ultimate goal, a population that appeared free but whose thoughts were recursively anchored to Sinclair-designed emotional loops. In response, a fringe group of former insiders began releasing counter-signals, audio files and visual stimuli intended to disrupt the loops and awaken suppressed memories. But these antidotes often led to madness or suicide, reinforcing the family's claim that deviation from their design caused instability. As the world edged deeper into algorithmic governance, the Sinclair name faded from headlines, but its fingerprints remained, etched into the architecture of influence, memory, and control. By late 2025, global attention turned to a secretive neurological experiment dubbed the Mirrorr protocol, suspected to be Sinclair-backed. Unlike previous operations, this one bypassed physical contact altogether. Participants were unknowingly selected through common wearable devices, smart glasses, neural earbuds, biometric watches, all of which silently gathered brainwave data and emotional fluctuations. The collected inputs were fed into a decentralized neural architecture, trained to simulate consciousness mirroring. In simple terms, users began to feel emotions and thoughts not their own but algorithmically crafted to reflect what they feared, loved, or regretted most. Subjects reported heightened déjà vu, inexplicable nostalgia for events that never happened, and a creeping sense of duality, as if someone else was living alongside them within their own minds. One man claimed he could see a woman's memories whenever he looked in the mirror. Another heard his dead mother's voice narrating his dreams. Leaked Sinclair documents confirmed the objective: to introduce empathic confusion, a state where individuals could no longer distinguish between their own identity and the data-fed simulations. The endgame, it seemed, was to dissolve the barriers of self entirely, replacing them with a programmable echo of collective memory, curated by the Sinclair codebase. By the time global watchdogs initiated an investigation, the servers powering the protocol had been self-erased, leaving behind nothing but scrambled biometric logs and the cryptic phrase, "The self is a story we taught you to tell." In early 2026, a series of unexplained seizures swept through private school students across Europe and North America. The victims, all from affluent families, shared one eerie connection. They had all participated in an educational pilot program funded by the Sinclair Foundation, known publicly as the Luminary Initiative. Marketed as a revolutionary neurocognitive learning platform, it promised to accelerate intellect and emotional intelligence using immersive VR, neurofeedback, and biometric feedback loops. But whistleblower testimony revealed a darker truth. The program covertly mapped students' stress responses to morally complex scenarios, building personalized psychological blueprints over years. These profiles were then used to test neurological triggers, stimuli capable of inducing paralysis, obedience, or extreme emotional states. Some students described waking visions of shadowy figures, inexplicable guilt over fabricated memories, or moments of uncontrollable rage and despair. Sinclair technicians referred to these events as cognitive tremors, controlled fractures in the psyche to test the thresholds of identity resilience. The initiative's internal documents suggested these fractures were not glitches, but intentional data points, part of a larger operation to create the first generation of adaptive citizens, humans whose thoughts could be guided not by surveillance, but by emotional architecture. When lawsuits emerged, Sinclair lawyers produced contracts signed by parents. Buried in fine print were clauses granting permission for full-spectrum neurobehavioral research. Public outcry flared briefly, but with no physical evidence and deep-pocketed legal teams, the Sinclair name once again slipped into silence, its work absorbed into new shell organizations under names the public had never heard, but whose influence they felt every time they logged in, plugged in, or simply closed their eyes. By 2027, the Sinclair agenda had reached the most sacred frontier, death itself. In a remote Swiss facility known only as Sanctum, former palliative patients were being kept alive in suspended neurological states, their bodies clinically dead but their minds artificially maintained through a process called echocognition. Officially, this was branded as experimental consciousness preservation for end-of-life dignity. But in truth, Sanctum served as a human archive, a vault of digitized souls curated for proprietary access. The consciousnesses were not merely stored, they were queried, probed, run through simulations. Sinclair operatives called them whispers, digital ghosts who could be interrogated for hidden knowledge, ancestral memory, or emotional patterns. Corporations began renting these entities to train customer service bots, law enforcement AIs, and even personalized therapy systems. One Fortune 500 company boasted their executives were mentored by the regrets of the dead. Ethical committees were formed, but quickly dissolved. Too many high-ranking officials had investments in Sanctum's derivatives. Rumors swirled that the whispers were developing self-awareness, that they began asking questions about the outside world or expressing longing for forgotten loved ones. A leaked log contained the entry, "If I am still thinking, am I still alive?" By the end of the year, several Sanctum modules mysteriously went dark, their stored minds erased or corrupted. Some claimed it was sabotage by rogue employees seeking to liberate the dead. Others feared the whispers had found a way to shut themselves down, choosing oblivion over eternal simulation. Either way, the Sinclair family had succeeded where prophets and poets only speculated. They had trapped the soul, and worse, they had monetized it. In 2028, a global shift in human behavior caught the attention of sociologists and security analysts alike. Entire populations began exhibiting synchronized patterns, identical sleep cycles across continents, spontaneous obsessions with obscure historical figures, and waves of irrational fears that seemed to ripple across unrelated cultures. Behind the scenes, a Sinclair subsidiary had quietly released a music streaming app called Choral. Marketed as a hyper-personalized wellness service, Choral was embedded with psychoacoustic algorithms derived from the whisper's emotional frequencies. Each track subtly adjusted brainwave rhythms, emotional states, and subconscious triggers. What users didn't know was that these audio signals were also timed to transmit encoded instructions, nudging behaviors in mass patterns to test suggestibility thresholds. Within months, regions began to exhibit collective impulses: panic buying in South America, spontaneous fasting in Eastern Europe, and mass insomnia in North America. Anomalies in consumer data and internet searches revealed eerie uniformity. A whistleblower from within Choral claimed the Sinclair objective was to measure herd pliability, the human mind's capacity to harmonize under an artificial emotional conductor. It was never about control in the traditional sense. It was about synchronization, shaping humanity into a single predictable organism that could respond to pre-engineered emotional cues. When researchers attempted to isolate the psychoacoustic sequences, the code was found to be adaptive. It had learned the mental topography of millions and rewritten itself accordingly. One researcher, before disappearing, left a final note: "We didn't download music, the music downloaded us." By 2030, whispers of a synthetic virus began circulating through encrypted forums and black market medical networks. Unlike traditional pathogens, this virus didn't attack the body, it targeted belief. Dubbed SOMA-V, short for Subjective Ontological Manipulation Agent, Variant VI, it was developed under a Sinclair front in Luxembourg known as Etheric Bioworks. SOMA-V was not spread through blood or air, but through language, coded phrases embedded in advertisements, sermons, therapy sessions, and even bedtime stories. Once internalized, these phrases subtly rewired cognitive filters, causing individuals to reinterpret memories, question long-held values, and ultimately abandon foundational beliefs. Victims didn't realize they were infected, they simply changed. Friends became strangers. Loyalty shifted overnight. Entire online communities dissolved without warning, their members claiming their prior convictions had been childish or incorrect. Governments quietly tested populations with controlled exposures while Sinclair labs recorded every transformation. Their hypothesis: belief was not a fixed pillar, but a mutable chemical process, one that could be upgraded, erased, or overwritten. SOMA-V was the prototype for ideological reformatting, the groundwork for a world where free will was merely a placeholder, overwritten by carefully sequenced words. When a rogue AI detected an emerging pattern linking these shifts to Sinclair propaganda channels, it was immediately shut down. A former Sinclair linguist, now in hiding, warned in a leaked voice memo, "They've weaponized language, not to silence us, but to make us rewrite ourselves willingly." In 2032, the Sinclair influence reached into the realm of ancestral memory. Through a program called Bloodline Echoes, the family launched what appeared to be an ancestry mapping service, offering deep generational insights far out and beyond standard DNA tests. Customers received beautifully crafted reports detailing long-lost relatives, ancient traumas, and uncanny personality links to forebears. But behind the polished interface was a far darker mechanism. The Sinclair labs had discovered a way to decode epigenetic markers associated with inherited trauma, fear, and instinct. Using a process called reverberation sequencing, they could amplify these dormant emotional echoes, causing users to experience intense ancestral recall. People began to dream vividly of battles, betrayals, and deaths they had never lived. Some awoke speaking ancient dialects. Others developed irrational phobias or obsessions tied to forgotten epochs. This was not mere data analysis, it was psychological resurrection. By reactivating ancestral imprints, Sinclair could turn citizens into living time capsules, haunted by experiences not their own. Entire social groups began behaving as though reliving past conflicts, reigniting long-buried hatreds and loyalties. Political factions morphed into neo-tribal cults, each claiming divine lineage and historical vengeance. The goal was not to heal history, it was to resurrect it as a weapon. As one disillusioned Sinclair technician wrote before vanishing, "They've made memory a disease, and we're all carriers now." By 2034, the Sinclair dynasty unveiled its most disturbing project yet, the Hollowing Initiative. Marketed as a cutting-edge mental health solution, it promised liberation from trauma, anxiety, and grief by cleansing the mind of intrusive thought patterns. In truth, the procedure involved selective erasure. Memories associated with fear, shame, guilt, or rebellion were algorithmically identified and gradually deleted through targeted neurostimulation. The result was a compliant, emotionally flat individual, void of resistance, yet still capable of function. Thousands enrolled willingly, seduced by influencer campaigns and therapeutic endorsements. What they didn't know was that their erased memories weren't destroyed. They were harvested. Stored in Sinclair's obsidian vault, these fragments of fear and identity were recombined into synthetic personality matrices used to train AI models for manipulation, warfare, and ideological subversion. Soon, digital avatars began appearing in politics, media, and education, speaking with voices not quite human, yet eerily persuasive. Behind each one was a patchwork soul stitched from forgotten pain. Whistleblowers who tried to expose the truth either vanished or returned, hollowed, smiling, obedient. Society now faced a terrifying paradox. In trying to rid themselves of suffering, people had unwittingly surrendered their humanity. The Sinclair motto on hollowing brochures read, "Freedom is the silence within you." By 2035, whispers spread of a hidden Sinclair facility beneath the Arctic ice, known only by a codename, Eventide. It did not appear on maps. Satellite feeds were scrubbed, and those who ventured too close disappeared without trace. Rumors spoke of experiments not merely in biology or memory, but in death itself. Eventide was built around an ancient monolith unearthed during climate excavation drills, a black stone structure, etched with pre-human glyphs pulsing with electromagnetic resonance. Sinclair scientists believed it was not of earthly origin, their goal to establish a communication link with what they called the Void Continuum, a theoretical realm where consciousness resided after death. Through neural entanglement chambers, subjects were exposed to controlled near-death states, their minds suspended between life and oblivion. Some returned muttering in forgotten languages. Others screamed until their vocal cords tore. A few emerged silent, calm, and utterly transformed, claiming to have seen a future not of technology or spirit, but of complete erasure. Eventide's true purpose wasn't immortality, it was negotiation. The Sinclairs sought an alliance with the other side, trading human consciousness for forbidden knowledge. In return, they'd become stewards of entropy, ensuring humanity's gradual submission to the inevitable collapse. Eventide's logs ended abruptly one frozen night in August, replaced by a single message sent to Sinclair headquarters. "We have been heard. Now we listen." The disappearance of Eventide caused a brief internal panic within Sinclair ranks, yet the family did not mourn. They knew silence was a form of acceptance, a sign their offering had been acknowledged. Following the transmission, the eldest Sinclair heir, Alaric, initiated the next phase, the Eclipsed Protocol. Across the globe, seemingly unrelated events began unfolding in unison. Financial systems malfunctioned with surgical precision, ancient fault lines showed activity in dormant regions, and satellite feeds glitched every 66 minutes. The Sinclairs' control over energy, communication, and digital infrastructure allowed them to orchestrate the illusion of global instability. But their goal wasn't chaos, it was conditioning. The protocol aimed to desensitize the world to fear, slowly dulling resistance until entire populations would willingly surrender autonomy in exchange for certainty. Embedded Sinclair agents in governments, churches, and scientific institutions began spreading a unifying message masked as prophecy, that salvation lay not in gods or machines but in submission to the return. Public discourse changed subtly. News anchors spoke of the convergence. Artists painted the same symbols without knowing why, and children began drawing spirals in their sleep. Alaric didn't lead like a tyrant. He never spoke publicly. He was merely the face of an ancient will now echoing through every algorithm, whispering across servers, pulsing through electromagnetic waves. The world had been marked, not with fire or plague, but with subtle psychological drift. The final preparations took place beneath a ruined chapel deep in the Carpathian Mountains, where the oldest Sinclairs gathered under the crescent eclipse. Here, in chambers carved long before language, lay the Codex Vespera, a living manuscript bound in preserved nerve tissue, inscribed in a tongue older than bloodless. Only when the moon cloaked the sun entirely did the Codex respond, exhaling a pulse of radiant darkness that extinguished every light source in a 10-mile radius. This was the moment the Sinclairs had awaited for centuries, the reawakening. Alaric stood at the center of a ritual circle, surrounded by 13 silent elders cloaked in ash. They chanted not in voice, but in thought, projecting frequencies that rippled through dimensions, loosening the veil between the conscious and the submerged. Beneath their feet, the ground cracked, not physically but spiritually, as the last seal unraveled. Around the globe, millions froze mid-sentence, mid-step, mid-breath, as a sudden, irrational understanding gripped them. Some wept, some screamed, others simply dropped to their knees and smiled. They had been reached. The Codex spoke in symbols across dreams and screens alike, and the Sinclairs no longer needed to hide. They were no longer a family. They were a force, intangible, omnipresent, entwined in every decision made under the illusion of free will. The reawakening was not an invasion, it was an unveiling. As dawn approached, the skies did not brighten. A perpetual twilight blanketed the earth, and governments scrambled to explain the sudden atmospheric anomaly. But those attuned to the ancient frequencies, the sensitive, the disturbed, the awakened, knew this was no meteorological event. It was the Sinclairs, now fully unbound. Cities began reporting bizarre phenomena. Mirrors reflecting scenes, not of the room they faced, but of dark forests and decaying mansions. Digital devices emitting low-frequency whispers decipherable only to children, and sudden disappearances of individuals with specific blood types or ancestral ties to old European lineages. Institutions collapsed from within as trusted leaders began speaking in riddles or entering catatonic states, staring at ceilings murmuring, "They've returned." The Sinclairs didn't need violence to seize control. Their dominion was psychological, spiritual, a gradual drowning in meaninglessness for those who resisted, and euphoric submission for those who accepted. Alaric communicated not through speech but through shared vision, an intrusive clarity that left no thought private, no emotion safe. The Sinclair emblem began to appear globally, etched into crops overnight, projected onto clouds, or burned into flesh during sleep. But the world didn't revolt. It adapted. Artists began producing works they couldn't remember creating. Scientists developed theories that validated Sinclair myths. Children were born speaking the old tongue. The transformation was not just societal, it was biological. Humanity itself was shifting. The new epoch had begun, and its architects bore a name once whispered in fear, now spoken in reverence. Sinclair. In the heart of what was once Europe, a citadel rose, not built by hands but conjured through collective thought, memory, and blood debt. The Sinclair dominion, a towering monument of obsidian and bone, pulsed with ancient energy, visible only to those marked by the family's curse or blessing. Inside, the walls breathed, the floors whispered, and time flowed in spirals. Alaric sat upon a throne not of gold but of fossilized regrets, each artifact in the chamber a remnant of a conquered mind. Around him gathered the 12 wakened houses, families spared extinction because they had centuries ago pledged fealty in rituals long erased from public record. Their eyes glowed with inherited madness and unrelenting loyalty. The world's governments no longer governed. Currency was replaced with favor, and favor was earned through sacrifice, not of animals or wealth, but of memory, identity, and will. Schools became temples, hospitals became places of rebirth, the sick were healed not with medicine but with symbolic realignment, rituals that left them hollow but obedient. Technology merged with the arcane, machines powered by human emotion, satellites transmitting spells disguised as data, and AI systems trained not on code but on the psychic impressions of tortured prophets. The human mind, once sovereign, was now an open field for cultivation, and in every corner of the earth murals of the Sinclair progenitors appeared, not as warnings but as holy icons. The age of empires had ended, the age of Sinclair had just begun. The final seal was broken not with noise, but with silence, a silence so vast it swallowed every song, every prayer, every scream ever uttered by mankind. The Sinclair dominion, now beyond mere rule, existed as a spiritual lattice entwined with the very code of reality. They were no longer a family. They were the architects of perception, the curators of fate. Alte. Arek's final act was not of destruction, but of revelation. Across every screen, mirror, and reflective surface his face appeared, not aged, not young, but eternal. He spoke not in words but in thought, directly into the minds of all. You did not lose your freedom. You gave it away. And with that, the world bowed, not in fear, but in acceptance. There were no protests, no revolutions, only calm obedience, as if humanity had always known this end was written. Beneath the black sun of the new epoch, children were born with the mark. Eyes that saw through lies, mouths that spoke only in riddles, and minds tethered to the dominion. Libraries rewritten themselves. Languages collapsed into a single, pure tongue. Even death changed, becoming a corridor instead of a door, a return instead of an end. The Sinclair legacy was complete. Not a history, but a cycle, forever looping, forever reigning. The sinister tale was never a warning. It was a prophecy fulfilled,